Hello, everyone. I'm Anthony Ong. I'm the director of the Cornell Center for Integrative Developmental Science. And I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today, Dr. Maria Gendron. Maria is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Yale, where she directs the Affective Science and Culture Lab. She received her BA and PhD from Boston College before completing a postdoctoral fellowship at Northeastern University with Lisa Feldman Barrett. I find her work to be fascinating in that she's examining how the mind, the brain, and the body, as well as things that exist outside of the mind, brain, and body, namely our social world, give rise to this phenomenon that we call emotion. And so I'm really looking forward to her talk. So with that, if you're ready, Maria, take it away.
So thank you so much, Anthony, for that kind introduction and for inviting me here to speak. I'm really excited to interact with this group, in part because some of the work I'll be presenting today is relatively new and I think very much in development and could use constructive comments and your energy and thoughts about it. So I hope that you'll feel free to post comments in the chat if you have questions throughout, or feel free to raise a hand and interrupt me if you have a clarifying comment or something that you want me to expand on. And certainly after the formal talk, we'll have time to really dig in, hopefully with more questions. So what I will be talking about today is this kind of amorphous idea of emotional expertise. The idea that some people kind of do emotions in a way that seems to be more expert or better than others. And we all probably have people in our lives that we would think of as having more or less expertise in emotion. So some people we know that are experts in emotion might notice the difference between very similar states like regret and disappointment, and they might be able to communicate about those distinct feelings relatively clearly to you. These individuals might also have pretty complex and rich repertoires for emotions. So even beyond the set here on the screen, they may feel emotions like awe and envy and astonishment. And people who are expert at emotion also seem to be adept at knowing when to express their emotions, when to maybe hold them at bay, and really how to wield their emotions like tools. So how to change their emotions to suit their circumstances, including doing seemingly counterintuitive things like ramping up negative emotions when they suit the purpose of the particular goal at hand. So in contrast, some of us may not experience emotions with such high fidelity or with such expertise. So emotions like anger and disgust and fear might be experienced actually in pretty similar ways. So just visualizing that here. And so for individuals who are relatively low in emotional expertise, they might think of their emotions in more coarse terms. So they may think of feeling bad or feeling negative. I don't feel so great today, or feeling good, right? So it's a good day. But they may not go as sort of deeper in terms of the types of emotion concepts that they're wielding, right, to understand their experience. So how we represent our experiences with language can be thought of really in two ways. So one is really just as a mere act of communication. I'm feeling some organized state, right? And I either can detect that organized state and use a word for it and communicate about it, or I don't have the word for it, but the state is still present. The other way to think about language is that it actually helps to scaffold emotions themselves. That is, what we learn, our kind of culturally learned concepts for emotions, actually give shape to this space. And so in this sense, emotions are partially constructed, right, by the meanings that we learn throughout a development. And so when we think about individual differences in the way that individuals experience emotion, one individual difference that I have worked on, and that's been pretty widely studied recently, is the idea of emotional granularity. And a conceptual definition of this is that individuals who are more emotionally granular are able to create differentiated and nuanced emotional experiences, right? By bringing their knowledge about formed from past experience, right, and learned to bear on the present moment. So what does this imply? Well, I think that one really important place to start is why we should care about granularity, right? So what has the prior literature already taught us about at least the correlates of this individual difference? So I'm going to do a little bit of self-promotion here and point you to a special issue that well, not quite self-promotion, I'm not an author in the special issue, but a special issue that I helped to co-edit along with Yasmin Urbas and Jennifer Fugate on emotional granularity. And this special issue is really focused on trying to delineate what are some of the pressing issues within the field, and also kind of how can we think more productively about the consequences of emotional granularity for people's everyday lives. And some of the kind of marquee findings that both reflect sort of continuity with the prior literature, but also some new findings, are that emotional granularity was linked to lower mental health symptoms. And we know that across a range of mental health disorders, there is, in general, lower emotional granularity that's been reported in the literature. We also see that there's more effective emotion regulation. So individuals, when they do attempt to regulate their emotions, will have lower efficacy if they're lower in emotional granularity, right? But higher efficacy if they're higher in emotional granularity. And finally, some really interesting findings suggesting that therapeutic success, right? So for example, the context of talk therapy or even medication adherence for individuals who have chronic conditions is at least within individuals with higher granularity, right, more efficacious. So I think all of this suggests that this is perhaps a construct that we should care about. We should be thinking about where granularity comes from and how, potentially flexible this individual difference is. Before I spend the rest of our time kind of talking about the findings in this literature, though, I want to spend a few moments on measurement, in part because this is, I think, one of the kind of pressing issues within this area of research. So measurement of emotional granularity has historically been based on one particular approach, which is the interclass correlation approach. And what's done in this area is to look at the way that individuals use emotion terms. So when they endorse feeling angry, right, and they endorse feeling sad, how does the structure of that term endorsement over time look? And individuals who are referred to as higher in granularity or higher in differentiation are often described as using words in a more specific manner. But what we're really getting at is simply whether word use is distinguishable over time. That is how correlated the words are. So I'm going to anchor this with an example. So in a typical study, participants might be asked to respond to questions on their smartphone, right? So this would be an example of an electronic momentary assessment study. And at a given time point, they would be asked to respond to a number of prompts. So how much do you feel disgust, anger, sad, fear, and so forth. But we don't stop at one time point, right? So that's a single snapshot of the individual's emotion at one point in time, but we'll also have multiple sampling instances across time. And so this structure of data, right? So having data over time allows us to look at the correlational structure between term use. One thing I want to note is that not all studies use the EMA type data collection. So there are actually a variety of different approaches in the literature. So perhaps the one that comes to mind for many individuals is EMA, but there are also daily diary approaches, adapted day reconstruction approaches, and then standard stimulus paradigms. So where individuals are doing a task, they might be shown a picture like an IAPS image, or a brief movie clip. They might read a scenario or even given a prompt, right, to think about a particular type of situation that they may have experienced. And all of these, right, could be considered a sampling instance where you collect this emotion endorsement over time. So how do we get to granularity? Well, the way that we typically look at this is really thinking about term correlations over time, as I said. So this is a hard to read, but a correlation matrix of actually 39 different terms that were used in a study that I conducted. I wouldn't recommend this generally as a number of terms to include in the study unless that's really a central question that you have. But what we can see is that there is some inherent structure, right, to how individuals are using these terms. You may be able to see off the bat that there are kind of quadrants for positive and negative terms here. So in general, individuals co-endorse negative terms and co-endorse positive terms. And to compute granularity, what we're simply doing is looking at the intra-class correlation within these negative terms and within the positive terms. And then typically what's done is these might be subtracted from 1 or multiplied by -1, and then Fisher Z transformed so that the score is more intuitive, meaning that a positive score is higher granularity, and that indicates that the person is using a term with more specificity over time. What we do know is, despite the fact that positive and negative granularity are often measured separately, they are correlated within individuals. So this has been reported across many studies, but the majority of the literature has really focused on negative granularity. And in part, this may be due to just some of the designs that researchers have used in their studies where there's an imbalance of negative terms relative to positive terms within the individual study. So James, should I take this now?
Oh, no rush.
Okay.
This is interesting, but yeah, this is wonderful.
Yeah, so you're asking about whether there are interesting kind of cross correlations. What I would say is that by and large, within a kind of North American college sample that like this, we don't see a ton of cross correlations, but you would expect, right? And this is kind of an issue with the way that we look at granularity currently, that in cultural contexts where it's more common to experience emotions in a dialectical manner, you would see many more cross correlations, right? And so this suggests that there's potentially some problems with the way that we're slicing things up and computing this interclass correlation only within valence, right? If you wanted to extend this work seriously to other cultural contexts. There are certain terms that tend to pose some challenges for this space as well. So if you think about surprise, right, that's an emotion that doesn't always cluster with positive states or negative states, right? You can have kind of different varieties of surprise. And so there we see that sometimes correlating with both. And then the approach can be either to look at it. So I've typically done a robustness check where I include it in an analysis, and then I might exclude it and see whether it impacts the nature of the findings. Great. Okay, any other questions on measurement here just before we move on? Okay, excellent. So previous findings in the granularity literature, as I mentioned, reveal a fair amount about the correlates of granularity, right? So we know that it's linked to lower mental health symptoms. It seems to be linked to better emotion regulation efficacy, better self-regulation for individuals who are experiencing high negative affect, and so forth. Less is known about how this individual difference comes about and the consequences of this individual difference for social processes. And so these are some of the issues that I'm going to tackle. In terms of how this comes about, so this isn't work that I was primarily the driver of, although I was a collaborator on it. I've been involved in some work trying to understand whether the nature of individuals' everyday experiences might actually shape their granularity. So if we think about the theory here, the theory is coming from a constructionist perspective. That's the model of emotion that I've worked from. The idea is that individual differences in granularity should really reflect differences in emotion concepts. And of course, where do those concepts come from? Well, they should come from prior experience. So one way that we gain expertise in our knowledge of emotion, the way we build concepts, is through direct instruction. And we'll talk about that later today. So, saying, are you feeling angry? Or it sounds like you're angry, right? And shaping one another's experiences in this kind of direct way in the moment. The other is, often, right, as adults, we don't have other individuals kind of coming around with us, prompting us about our emotional states, but we do have the potential to expand our emotional repertoires just by gaining different kinds of experiences, right? By potentially putting ourselves in new contexts where different kinds of emotional states will emerge. And so this is the question that my colleague, Katie Heyman, tackled in some recent work. So what the study did was use natural language processing methods to look at archival data where individuals described everyday experiences of emotion. These same individuals underwent experience sampling, so that electronic momentary sampling approach that I was describing earlier. And this is across 3 different studies that she looked at data of this type. And what she provided support for was this idea that individuals who are more emotionally granular tend to describe a greater diversity of daily experiences. So what we did was we analyzed descriptions of everyday events, and using the meaning extraction method, which is a sort of data-driven language analysis approach, we quantified different themes that were present in individuals' self-reported descriptions of their experiences. And then we looked at the range of different themes that were captured across their experiences. And so what you can see is that an individual here on the left has high diversity of different types of experiences. So experiences that are cross-cutting lots of different themes. Whereas this individual has relatively low diversity of experiences, meaning they're having really just one particular type of experience over and over again. And what's pretty striking is that when you look at the granularity profile of individuals who are relatively low in experiential diversity versus individuals who are relatively high in experiential diversity, this tracks with emotional granularity. So individuals who have less diversity in their daily experiences tend to be less granular in their emotions. Now, we'd like to make a sort of neat story here that experiential diversity is really driving granularity, right? So as you kind of gain more experience, you potentially refine your understanding of yourself, and your emotion concept use, right, will eventually become more granular over time. It's possible that the reverse is also the case, right? So more granular people may end up seeking out these different types of experiences. And likely it's actually a bi-directional relationship here. But I think this data is nicely illustrating where we need to go in terms of trying to understand what is actually the driver of these individual differences, and how can we start to think about potentially moving these granularity around in individuals who are lower. Okay, so in the rest of my talk today, I'm going to dive further in exploring emotional expertise in context. And what I mean by that is I'm going to take you on a tour of some of my lab's recent work, where we're trying to think about how emotional expertise works either in a relational context, how emotional expertise might influence the way that we perceive others, and then finally thinking about this within the context of socialization and culture. And so the actual studies that I'll take you through are somewhat heterogeneous in terms of their methods, right, and the way that we approach the topic, but they're all unified by this kind of core idea that while emotional expertise, right, seems to have these correlates, we need to start to understand in a more fine-grained way, right, how individuals are navigating their worlds differently depending on their level of emotional expertise. Okay, so to start, we're going to begin by thinking about relational context. And it probably comes as no surprise to you that romantic relationships are a really important context in which to study emotions. Although expressions of negative emotion in the context of conflict can sometimes have downsides for a relational partner, generally speaking, expression of emotion can have interpersonal benefits as well as intrapersonal benefits. So it can lead to greater relationship closeness, satisfaction, and maintenance of a relationship. So given that there are these positive outcomes, we can also think about how one responds to the emotional expressions of a partner. And what we know is that when you perceive your partner in a way that is understanding, validating of their experience and expressing care, this is generally a good thing. So this is referred to as perceived partner responsiveness in the literature. And perceived partner responsiveness, again, seems to help to support healthy functioning relationships, including maintaining closeness, intimacy, and effective communication within the couple. So in this work, we were interested in exploring perceived partner responsiveness further. As we were designing the work, we actually came across a really nice study that looked at how interpersonal accuracy, right? So if I perceive my partner accurately, right? So based on their self-reported emotion, how does that impact PPR? And we see that indeed it does, right? So lending support for this idea that there should be these direct links between emotion perception and PPR. So this work was done in collaboration with my graduate student, Eva Liu, who's leading the work, and Margaret Clark, my colleague at Yale. And what we generally wanted to do was to try to probe emotional granularity, but do it in a way that is really sort of bounded by this relational context. So what we did was we gave individuals a series of relational scenarios from complementary perspectives. So for example, your partner complains to you that you're spending too much time with someone else, or you complain to your partner that they're spending too much time with someone else. And then we had individuals report on a range of emotions. We actually sampled 23 different emotions based on piloting work. I'm only showing just a schematic of the data here. And we had participants report on how they would feel in the situation, and then also how their partner would feel, right? So they're reporting from these complementary perspectives on themselves and their partner. And we had them do this for 12 different scenarios that we pre-tested as kind of having realism and relational relevance to these couples. And these are really everyday type scenarios. So what we did then was we computed granularity from the self-reports from these two different perspectives. So here are some of those correlation matrices that I showed you earlier. And so here, just as an example, we can see that the experiencer seems to be much lower in granularity than the perceiver in this example, right? So they're showing these really high correlations between negative emotion terms, whereas their partner is showing actually a lot of differentiation, right, across different emotion terms. And of course, we had perceivers and experiencers report on both themselves and one another. So we have both perception and experience granularity scores from both members of the dyad. Now, in general, what we find is that granularity is correlated within the couple. So that's quite interesting and sort of where my intuitions about this line of research started, which was wondering whether couples tend to kind of seek out partners that are similar, right, in terms of their emotional expertise. And I think we can say, at least from this sample, right, that this seems to be the case. But what about the consequences of this, right? So is it the case that granularity actually matters for the relationship, right? For how the partners feel about one another, how supported they feel. So in this study, what we did was we recruited 185 couples, and they were recruited on Prolific. And we measured, in addition to that task that I told you about, we measured beliefs about the partner's emotional granularity. And this is in part because, when we started this line of work, Some of this was really built on these intuitions, right, about observing couples and sort of their perceptions, right, having conversations with people about their perceptions of the emotional expertise of their partner. And so it may be the case that perceptions matter too, right, not just reality. So we adapted a measure that's been used to measure beliefs about one's own emotional granularity called the Range and Differentiation of Emotional Experience Scale. And we had individuals report on items like, my partner is aware of the subtle differences between the feelings they have. So if you are partnered, you can think about how you might respond to an item like this about your partner. Then we also had participants complete the Perceived Partner Responsiveness Scale, as I alluded to earlier, and that contains items like, my partner understands me. So our predictions were threefold. So first, we were interested in whether granularity of perceptions of the partner might lead to perceived partner responsiveness. That is, if I have a more fine-grained representation of what my partner is feeling, they're likely to feel that I am understanding, validating, and caring of their emotions, right? So this idea that in order to get to these kinds of responsive behaviors, you have to have some degree of precision in understanding your partner. We also were interested in misalignment. So despite the fact that couples are correlated, they're not perfectly correlated, and some couples are relatively higher, with one partner relatively higher in granularity than the partner. And so we were interested in whether misalignments might lead to lower perceived partner responsiveness. And then finally, we were interested in these beliefs. So is it the case that when someone believes that their partner is, better able to navigate their emotional worlds, right, so more differentiated, does their partner then perceive them, right, as more understanding, validating, and caring? So I'm going to kind of give away the punchline early here, which is that we didn't actually find support for our first two predictions. So as you can imagine, recruiting, 185 couples, we were a little bit disappointed by this finding at first. But I think that, the more I thought about it, the kind of more interesting these findings became, in the sense that they suggest that beliefs are really what matters in this space, right? The way that you think your partner operates, and not so much perhaps the way that they're actually representing your state. So just to give you a snapshot of what the analyses look like for this type of data, we conducted what are called actor-partner interdependence models, or APIM. And so what the APIM allows us to do is look at how a given person's beliefs, right, about the other person predict both their own perceived partner responsiveness. So people who believe that their partners are, differentiated, also believe that their partners are understanding, supporting, and caring. And that makes a lot of sense. This seems to be kind of a, could be a general positivity effect, right, about the partner. But we can also look at how partner or person one's beliefs about person two impact person two's reports, right? And this is called a partner effect, and is really revealing these sort of dyadic relationships between these variables. And here we see that there is a relationship between person one's beliefs and person two's reported PPR. So what can we conclude? I think at this point, only beliefs about partners' granularity predicted PPR. In some exploratory analyses that I didn't show, we did find that agreement on emotion, so just alignment, correlation between the ratings of the two partners, did predict PPR. So it suggests that alignment does matter. But, as I mentioned, granularity doesn't have this direct effect. We do see that granularity is related to alignment, right? So individuals who are more granular will tend to be more aligned with their partner. And so it may be the case that what's going on here is that there is this kind of indirect route to your partner feeling understood, validated, and cared for. But whether you are high or low in granularity doesn't matter as much as whether you agree with or your perception agrees with what they say they will feel. So one of the things that we do feel a little bit skeptical about is, whether we are really capturing the meaningful types of events that couples experience in their daily lives. So is it the case that we're potentially underestimating the importance of granularity, right, by using these hypothetical scenarios. They're not real world situations, right? We're not following people in their everyday lives. So we have a dyadic experience sampling study that we've embarked on, not for the faint of heart, but we're really excited by the possibilities of really answering this question perhaps more definitively with this data, right? And seeing whether granularity kind of out there in the wild has any consequence for the partner. We also can look, there's been some innovation in this space, looking at granularity kind of on a momentary basis. So using both the global pattern of reports and the pattern at that moment. And so we also could look at more fine-grained temporal relationships potentially between granularity and the partner's experience. So I think what these findings also point to, though, is that we maybe need to be thinking a little bit more expansively about emotional expertise. So, you know, giving individuals a checklist of terms, right, that they're endorsing is clearly revealing something about the nature of individuals' emotion concepts and how they're wielding them, you know, in the moment, but it may not be a sort of, or it certainly isn't a comprehensive way to understand emotional expertise. And in part, if we think that those beliefs about the partner are picking up on something, right, we should also be on the lookout for other ways that individuals may be informing these kinds of beliefs. So I'm just going to pause here. I saw a question in the chat. So how does my partner's emotion granularity affect my PPR? So if my partner does not differentiate my emotions, they cannot understand my needs. Did they analyze that? Yes, great question. So that's actually, that was the kind of first aim here that we tested, which is so this is granularity of perceptions of the partner, predicting the perceived partner responsiveness. And we didn't see support for that. And I think that, again, this is perhaps because there's this indirect route through agreement that's accounting for that relationship. Okay. So one thing that I think is pretty illuminating. And if you think back to the way that I sort of started my talk and introduced the construct of granularity, I talked about people sort of using the terms good and bad, right, versus these more specific nuanced terms. But that's not actually what we're measuring, right, when we assess granularity using the ICC-based approach that I've described up to this point. And this was nicely pointed out by Renee Thompson and colleagues. So they said in their review paper in 2021, to explicate the construct of differentiation, researchers typically provide examples of how people low or high in differentiation would describe how they're feeling. According to these examples, people low in differentiation tend to report they feel pleasant or unpleasant, using general terms like good and bad. In contrast, people high in differentiation will use precise terms like angry, sad, and happy. And so what Thompson and colleagues are pointing out, right, is that there's a mismatch between the construct definition, the way that we talk about granularity, and the operationalization. So what I'm going to do now is actually pivot to this other operationalization. I don't have the perfect bridge for you in the sense that I don't have within the last study that I talked about a measure, right, of the naturalistic language use of those individuals. But we can start to build a case for why looking at individuals, the words that they're using, right, their naturalistic language use is important and potentially a way to think about emotional expertise. So what I'm going to do is talk about this in the context of emotion perception. And I hope in a couple of slides, I'll be able to motivate for you more why I'm focusing on emotion perception. And here what we're going to do is think about how natural language use, right, potentially provides a window into emotional expertise that explains how individuals vary in emotion perception. So perhaps it's not surprising to the folks in this audience that emotion concepts are developing across the lifespan. So we know that even through the teenage years, emotion concepts are still undergoing development and becoming more abstract. So individuals kind of learn to give the sort of general form, right, of the emotion definition in that, so in the later teenage years. And even into sort of older adulthood, at least we see cohort type effects, right, with more differentiated terms being used by older adults when they're doing emotion perception sorting tasks. This is the Heyman et al. Reference there. So, what this suggests is that one way that we can study emotional expertise is really just by looking at the active emotion vocabulary of individuals to try to understand how this influences their emotional lives. And there's actually been a pretty large literature, some of which I've contributed to, focused on how emotion words, right, anchoring emotion knowledge, shape emotion perception. So prior research has decreased access to emotion words using a method called semantic satiation, where you repeat the word many times, or increased access to emotion words using language priming type methods. And in general, what we see is that lots of different ways that you can assess emotion perception are impacted, right? So priming type effects, even looking at perceptual memory or the neural representation. So what these findings suggest is that at least when we experimentally manipulate language, there seems to be some consequences for emotion perception. But what they're really not revealing is whether this holds kind of on an individual difference level, right? So are the kind of repertoires that individuals have for emotions impacting the way that they do emotion perception in everyday life. So getting at the nature of emotion perception is itself tricky. Many of the tasks that you may have used yourselves or observed in the literature have pretty simple features to them. So often we present a static, decontextualized stimulus, right, and ask individuals to select a label from a checklist, right, or indicate when that face changes or match two faces to one another. But of course, in the real world, emotion perception is a much more complex and contextualized phenomena. And so the goal of this particular study was to really try to move the ball and use methods that better capture that complexity, right? That challenge that we undergo when we are inferring emotion in others. So to start, we're using the framework of looking at the active emotion vocabulary. So that is, we're interested in just the words that individuals not spontaneously, but produce in our task to when they're inferring emotion in other individuals. And interestingly, there is some prior work. So here I'm citing Vine and colleagues, their 2019 paper, where they actually suggest that having a broader repertoire of emotion words that an individual uses can actually link to mental health symptoms, so heightened mental health symptoms. And so I think one puzzle is trying to disentangle why that is and when it is the case, right, that you observe this relationship versus not. A lot of their data was diary type data, and so maybe that just general emotionality has something to do with it. Yes, James.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify, when you say heightened mental health symptoms, exactly what you meant?
Yeah. Yeah, so the mental health measures that they used were derived from natural language as well. So this was all kind of archival data. And this was using, building on some work that James Pennebaker and colleagues have done, trying to kind of use natural language to get at sort of mental health symptom presentation. So it's not direct reports, right? And it may be the case that that is part of why the findings kind of turn out the way that they do. But what they quantify is just the range of emotion terms that an individual generates, right? So not kind of frequency, but the diversity of those terms that they generate, and then linking that to these natural language processing based assessments of mental health symptomatology.
And just thank you, that's very helpful. But then
Yeah.
heightened mental health symptoms, do you mean like more pronounced
more
negative
words? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so very counterintuitive findings, and kind of it very much in tension, I would say, with at least how we talk about granularity in the literature, how we think about maybe expanding your emotional vocabulary as this very productive thing. So I think this is a tension that needs to get resolved. I won't fully resolve it in this work, but what I will say is that we did not share that prediction that broader vocabulary would have downsides. Instead, we predicted that having a more productive emotion vocabulary would actually support emotion perception. So the other shift that we have here from the prior literature and the studies that I described briefly earlier is that we are examining emotion perception in a more dynamic way. That is, we're looking at continuous stimuli, videos, and asking individuals to perceive emotion in these kind of rich, dynamic, contextualized stimuli. There's a lot of really nice work that's just coming out, both within the sphere of emotion, so these papers by Chen and Whitney, but also just within the behavior kind of perception literature. So there's a burgeoning field called event perception, where cognitive scientists or in cognitive psychology, individuals are interested in how we kind of parse the ongoing stream of others' activity, right, and perceive the discrete behaviors that individuals are engaging in. And so we're taking both kind of methods from that literature, as well as actually doing an event perception task as a control task in this line of work. So finally, what we wanted to do was to quantify consensus instead of stipulated accuracy. And this is in part because attention in the existing emotion perception literature, many researchers start with these a priori, canonical facial expressions, right, and use those as the basis for determining whether someone is accurate or not. Here we wanted to take more of a cue from the empathic accuracy literature and think about consensus. Instead of thinking about dyadic consensus, so do I agree with the person who's expressing emotion, instead we're looking at group level consensus. So this is really a cultural consensus type method to try to understand how individuals agree with one another or not, right, in the emotions that they perceive in a social target. So in each of these choices, has upsides and downsides for how we think about operationalizing emotion perception, but these were the choices that we had. So as I alluded to, we are conducting this research in the context of one of America's favorite pastimes, so viewing movies. And this work was led by my graduate student Shimong Lee, as well as a couple of former research assistants. And in the study, our participants who were recruited online completed a segmentation task. And in the task, what they do is they watch film clips. In this first study, it was often film clips that were kind of within the romantic genre, in part because those are great for seeing lots of ebb and flow, positive to negative shifts and everything in between within a short clip. And individuals viewed the clip and they would press, pause whenever they observed a change in emotion. So this could be the onset or the offset of an emotion in any of the social targets in the film. And then they would be asked to provide their own label. So, what is it that you see? So very kind of messy data, right? But helpfully so. So they viewed 6 different clips, and they also completed 3 different control action clips where they were parsing the behavior of targets, just to look at the specificity of the effects that we're talking about here. We also had a pre-registered study too, and this looked at the same task, but for documentary clips. So trying to get a little bit closer to naturalism with this design. So I'm just going to, I think I didn't share with audio, so I'll just press play, but you may not be able to hear the audio. There was audio during the task. Okay, this is looping. Sorry about this. This happened. I think this happened last time I tried to present this and I forgot. Okay, so there are more emotional events than just that happiness. So this is a couple, they're getting news about the gender, they're expecting a baby, and there's some mixed emotions in the room. And so you can kind of see this unfold over time. So what we do to quantify performance here is take these segmentations that individuals make, and we can compute a few different metrics. So one is referred to as mean length of unit. So this is coming directly from the event segmentation literature. And here, a longer kind of unit, right, longer length, means that individuals are less fine-grained in their segmentations, right? So they're waiting longer between across the film clip between emotional segmentations, whereas shorter length of unit, right, means that that person is segmenting quite a bit. And we do see pretty robust individual differences in this. We can also look at what we refer to as segmentation agreement. Again, this is coming directly from the event segmentation literature. And here what we do is we bin the data into 1 second bins, and we look at essentially a point by serial correlation. So if the individual made a segmentation within a bin, right, and then looking at the correlation between that and the group level summary of how many segmentations there were within that bin. And then that's bounded by so it's controlling for the number of segmentations in total that someone made, so that it's a kind of cleaner metric just of segmentation agreement as opposed to this length of unit. Finally, we computed a new metric, and this was in part because of a little bit of concern about the kind of timing, the dynamics of the segmentation agreement metric. So these events are kind of complex and unfold over time. And I'm thinking about this in 1 second bins, you might get penalized actually for going early, right, and detecting an emotion just as it's onsetting. And so we wanted something that was a little bit more generous. So what we did was we used this segmentation magnitude approach, which essentially fits Gaussian distributions to each of those segmentations and then computes a group level magnitude. And then you can threshold that based on what random responding would look like. And so the events that are detected here, these are noted in green, are the events that are kind of crossing that threshold. So we can then use change point detection to find really the start and the end of these events. So setting these event envelopes, and then look at whether individuals are segmenting within those what we call consensus events. And so we refer to this metric as consensus event agreement, and we think that it strikes a nice balance between looking at the group level agreement, but also not penalizing individuals for the subtleties of the timing of when they make a segmentation. Any questions about this quantification? I know this is a bit of information, so I want to pause here if there's any clarification I can provide.
I think it's super clear, but it's fascinating to see this example of the sparse labeler giving sort of unique terms, which I think would almost goes against, as an example of kind of what you were suggesting might be happening earlier in earlier hypothesis. That's actually fascinating, like sarcasm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not the case that they are. So I think term uniqueness is kind of a, we can talk, I'll say something more about sort of how we're quantifying this. So one is, is the individual producing kind of complex terms, right, that are really distinct or sort of like ones that would be acquired at a later age of acquisition? Are they actually using a lot of different terms, right? So what's the kind of productivity of the vocabulary? And so here in this example, we tried not to kind of yoke the two together. This is just a toy example. So I'll show you next kind of how they can be broken apart. Karina asks how this is affected by careless responding. So we did do a fair amount of like reliability and validation work on this. I'm not going to go into those details right now, but looking at within individual reliability across trials, test-retest reliability, correlation between this task and other existing emotion perception tasks in the literature, in part because we were concerned, right, that this could be kind of more of a motivated task for some individuals. And we do say that it kind of has all of the psychometric properties that one would hope. Okay, so our prediction very simply was that segmentation performance would track with an individual's active emotion vocabulary. And by active emotion vocabulary, what we quantified was first the number of unique labels an individual provided. So how many different terms are they giving? And then we also quantified the average age of acquisition of those labels. So these are kind of, it's possible that an individual could provide, very few unique labels, but they're all these really sort of complex states, right, that they're coming up with that are terms that people acquire later in development. So this is just an example of the typical age of acquisition that you would see for different types of terms that individuals would provide on this task. So frustrated, right, is emerging later than happy and sad and angry. So did we find a link between dynamic emotion perception and active emotion vocabulary? The answer is yes. So in study 1, what we find is that consensus event agreement metric that I described as our new metric was correlating both with the number of unique labels and age of acquisition. And we see the same general pattern with our other measures. Here, mean length of unit, we would expect a negative association because a longer unit is meaning that they're segmenting less finely. We also find that this consensus event agreement effect replicated in our pre-registered study 2. We did also compute the other analyses between mean length of unit and segmentation agreement and see those replicating as well. And so this suggests that the words that an individual has within their repertoire, right, so the different types of words that they can generate seem to have something to do with simply their ability to know when an emotion is happening, right, in a way that aligns with other individuals, right? So our measures of emotion perception performance are not contingent on kind of shared meaning, right? But there seems to be this strong link there. So I think to summarize, we can say that individual differences in active emotion vocabulary are correlating with segmentation performance. I think these have good implications for everyday emotion perception in the sense that we are having participants perceive emotion in these complex and really naturalistic type stimuli. And so we can imagine that an individual's active emotion vocabulary might have a role to play as they navigate, their everyday lives. In ongoing work, we are a little bit concerned about the fact that this is a kind of motivated task, right? We're asking individuals to segment, and maybe that changes the nature of how they process these stimuli. So we are doing a psychophysiology study where we're looking at, in the lab, passive viewing of these stimuli to try to understand whether the physiological profile and response to these stimuli can tell us something about segmentation. So are individuals who have physiological responses to these stimuli that are more or less in consensus with the group, also having also segmenting in a way that's more or less in consensus with the group. Okay, so I think these findings fit with calls to improve emotion vocabulary in social emotional contexts, including in therapeutic practice and talk therapy, but also just what we do with our kids, right? So teaching them lots of emotion words and getting those board books that teach them about all of these things very early on. And I think that this is a reasonable kind of conclusion and implication to draw from this work. But the tension for me is that I've done a lot of work cross-culturally where this may not actually hold. So some of my other work that I didn't talk about here today has explored emotion perception in small-scale societal contexts, as well as in a range of other different industrialized cultural contexts. And what we see is that individuals are not always using this sort of broad set of mental state labels that we see in the task I just showed you. In many cases, what individuals anchor on are behaviors, right? So the person's laughing, or how the person is fitting within the context, right? So they want to fight, right? So what their behavioral intent is. And so this kind of gives us a bit of a puzzle, right? Is it the case that we can say that emotion labeling is always good, is always important, and is something that individuals, should be taught, right, kind of globally? In the interest of time, I'm just going to jump to one finding, so kind of a teaser here, to suggest to you that this may not always be important or necessary for individuals. So in this study, which we conducted in the US and in China, we developed a retrospective scale where individuals reported on their socialization for emotion. So individuals reported on whether their parents labeled their feelings when they were growing up, whether they tried to discuss the causes of their feelings, and whether parents would talk about feelings, right? So say you're watching a movie together or reading a book, right? Do you then discuss the feelings of the social targets within those cultural artifacts? And the scale had a one-factor structure, showed good reliability across, we had multiple waves and culture and strong test-retest association. I think, of course, there's always a healthy dose of skepticism that we should have about retrospective reporting, but this is the best that we can do at the moment. And so the question for us was whether it's the case that socialization of emotion, so this discussion of emotion that is very prevalent, right, in North American cultural context, has the same consequences for adult mental health cross-culturally. And what we see is that more frequent emotion discussion was associated with lower depressive symptoms among individuals we sampled in the US. This was not the case for the participants that we sampled in China. So we don't see this robust association. And we were a little bit concerned about the way that depression symptoms were measured in this first wave of the study. So we also followed up using some of Andrew Ryder's work that looks at both somatization and psychological symptoms of distress. And again, we see this same pattern of findings where there's not this link between at least retrospective reports of caregiver emotion socialization and mental health symptoms in adulthood. So I think we can, summarize at least from this finding that socialization of emotion discussion may not be a functional universal. So there's wonderful work that Chi Wang did on this topic in the 2000s and sort of continuing. And here, what we're suggesting is that kind of into adulthood, the way that we think about the functioning of emotion concepts and how they might support, well-being and self-regulation may be culturally variable. So I think the, big picture kind of push here is that we need to consider potentially some alternative cultural models for development and socialization of, emotional expertise and the links to mental health, and perhaps not overly anchor on mental state labels, right, in cultural contexts where it's not as relevant to do so. And so we have a review paper that's still under review, but hopefully will be accepted soon with my former postdoc, Ka Ip, who is the collaborator on the work I just shared with you, where we make the proposal that it may be productive to start to research emotional granularity in a more expansive way and really focusing on kind of experiential expertise more broadly. Okay, so just want to acknowledge all of the amazing folks from my lab and collaborators that helped with this work. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you and hearing your questions.
Thank you, Maria. I will invite folks who have questions to place them in the chat. If it's okay with you, I'll take this opportunity as moderator to ask a couple questions. So I have a broad question and maybe a specific question about one of your studies. So the broad question, and I won't ask you to define an emotion, but so I think the idea of likening emotional granularity with emotional expertise seems very reasonable to me, and I think you make a compelling case for why it may be foundational to emotion perception. But one might have the intuition that benefits of granularity are more than simply the ability to distinguish discrete emotional states, and it seems to me that should somehow include some sort of causal understanding of what gives rise to those emotions. In other words, the question is, how do we bring context right into emotional granularity such that, the intuitive idea that I'm thinking here is that, people who are granular although I don't see evidence of this, the intuition is that they do have a causal understanding of why they're feeling different emotions, right? So when they report feeling sadness and they're able to distinguish it from, say, being in an anxious state, that they understand the context, the different contexts that give rise to those distinct emotional states. And yet, most of the ways in which these measures are assessed leave context out altogether. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, whether you think it's fruitful to somehow bring context back in, and then maybe the more challenging question, how do we do that?
I love this question. This is a self-critique I've had for a while. So these studies are, I think all of them are suggestive, right? There's a lot of correlational data. We don't have a lot of data directly linking concepts and granularity. We don't have a lot of data. There's now a couple of preliminary findings out there in the literature showing that you can push granularity around. And so we can start to build a kind of causal story on the other end. But I agree, I think this is a huge gap in the literature. So completely fair critique. I think and I will say just one more thing on that point, which is that there's now this kind of new construct of emotion regulation flexibility using the ICC in the exact same way that we're using it in granularity, and adopting some of the same assumptions, right? So individuals who have a lower ICC for emotion regulation use over time, the assumption is that they have a more contextual use. We don't know that. There's one lovely paper by Yasmin Urbis and colleagues, I think from 2015, where they tried to start to tackle this context question. So what they had individuals do was report on kind of like the abstract ways that we represent context, which is reporting on appraisals. And then they looked at how the use of appraisals over time in different situations relates to granularity. And what they show is that individuals who have higher granularity are using those appraisals in a more kind of discrete manner across situations, right? So I think that that's kind of starting to get to this question. And we have similarly, so in our dyadic experience sampling study that we're doing right now, we'll be looking at those same kinds of appraisals, right, of the context, so that we can start to look at these questions in more depth. It doesn't fully solve the concepts question. So there's Chi Wang actually has a really nice task for kids where kids are the emotion knowledge task, where they are asked to give different causes, right, of anger, or different causes of sadness. And so I think, it's not unreasonable to do something like that in adults and try to look at the kind of diversity of causes that individuals generate. We would expect that individuals who have more breadth to their emotion concepts, meaning that they have different situations, right, that they can link to that concept, might actually have the more granular profile, right, because they can sort of flexibly use that concept. But I think it's a hypothesis and we don't have data for it yet. I think, did I tackle both parts of your question?
Yeah, no, that was cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Just another kind of clarification question, or just a question about one of your earlier studies in which you look at granularity and partner responsiveness. And at one level, it doesn't surprise me that the belief measure of granularity predicts the partner responsiveness measure, to the extent that these beliefs track with global perceptions. And I guess the question is, did you measure responsiveness more dynamically, like on kind of a daily basis? Because I think that if you did, it's reasonable to me, at least, to think that because you're collecting, if I understand it correctly, these emotion data using experience sampling, right? So you might expect, for example, that on days in which people are more granular, they might be also reporting greater partner responsiveness, and that it's what you're not finding may be kind of an artifact of the, not an artifact, but the kind of a level of analysis kind of outcome where these things are not, they're tracking with things that are like at the same level, if you will. of analysis?
Absolutely. I think some of the most exciting work that's happening in the granularity space is looking at these kind of dynamics. So for a long time, we talked about granularity as a trait. It's not always so trait-like, right? So people move about quite a bit in this space. Some of it may be motivational, right? So that's a big piece that we're not really tackling in a lot of this literature. I think obviously the motivated empathy field, right, is showing us that people, it's costly, right, to infer what other people are feeling and to care about it and to do something about it. And so certainly, I think we can think about granularity in that same way. I will actually have to go back and check. Our EMA protocol for the study we're running right now got very bloated, and then we had to kill a lot of our darlings in the last stage. And so I know at one point that was on the table, but I'll have to check and see whether we ultimately removed it. But I think it's a beautiful hypothesis. Hopefully we'll have data on it, but I don't know.
Great. Thank you, Maria. So let me get to some of the questions in the chat. So Tyler asks, did you assess measurement invariance across the two countries for this scale? Presumably, the scale here is the depression measure.
Yes, so we, well, for the caregiver emotion discussion scale, the new scale. So we did look at measurement invariance, and it didn't fully meet all of the criteria, which is why, so we don't do any mean level comparisons in this work because we're a little bit concerned about that. In general, we did also find something pretty surprising, which was that the caregiver emotion discussion reports were higher in our Chinese sample than in our US sample. Some of this may, there's well-known kind of anchoring effects that can impact these kinds of cross-cultural scales. So it may be the case that the reference group that individuals in China are using is, quite different than the reference group in the US. We did ask about frequency, but I don't think that we can rule that out. So that's why we're being a little bit more conservative and only focusing on these kind of within sample relationships. I think that there's this kind of tension, right? For us, there was with this particular measure, which is wanting to kind of move forward and try to measure this thing that hasn't been measured in the literature, taking our best stab at it, being able to make productive use of the data, and then not kind of meeting all of the perfect standards of, scale construction across the two cultures. So that's kind of how we're handling it right now. I do think it would be potentially useful to do actually some more kind of anthro-based scale development work. So do cognitive interviewing and really try to understand how the scale is functioning a little bit more. And that might help us to disentangle what's going on with it, why people are reporting the way that they are. But thank you for the question. I think it's an important issue.
Right, there's a question/comment from my colleague Corinna here. She asked, and I'll just read it, pardon me, but how does your work relate to the clinical literature on alexithymia? Your measure in the couple study reminds me of Richard Lane's level of emotional awareness scale. Relatedly, the fact that greater granularity differentiation conveys more positive emotionality reminds me of Vivif's dynamic integration theory, where she differentiates between affect optimization versus differentiation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for these thoughts and questions. So I think that the answer to sort of how these constructs relate to one another is actually not simple at all. It's a very, so when I started and I said emotional expertise is amorphous, this is kind of what I meant, that the literature is not very systematic, and many researchers are not quite talking to one another, and it's costly, right, to include many measures in any individual different study. There's a review that I referenced earlier. I'll just kind of pull up the slide so that you have the citation by Katie Heyman, the researcher that I mentioned. She's a postdoc at KU Leuven, but she completed a systematic review of emotional expertise, including granularity and these other related constructs. And what she does is she actually looks at both the correlational structure between these constructs sort of across studies, as well as just the kind of conceptual overlap. So how many studies kind of include both constructs in them, and then also tries to really admirably decompose these constructs into really what the underlying features are. So what are the claims that are being made about them? So I can't venture to summarize her work in the few moments that we have now, but I think it's an excellent resource. In terms of what we've done, so I have included alexithymia and the RD scale, right? So the measure of beliefs, for example. When you look, so within the couples study, for example, when you look at the relationship between beliefs and measured granularity, they don't correlate. When you look at alexithymia and measured granularity, the correlation is sometimes there, but it's modest. So I think that the way to think about this is twofold. One is that people have, beliefs about their kind of emotional competency that in some cases may not reflect reality, right? It may be these sort of more pessimistic views of how they do emotion, right? And maybe one aspiring to do better. I think the other point is that the granularity construct is kind of missing some aspects of emotional complexity, right? So it's missing this, the productivity of language that people can generate and so forth. So to some extent, right, what this area really needs is probably a very big data collection effort that's, kind of collaborative, where we try to tackle the, instead of this piecemeal fashion that the literature's in, really try to tackle the relationship between these constructs kind of a priori in the study. So for me, what I've tried to do is measure beliefs, right? So use these scales that measure beliefs and in part try to understand how they relate to one another. So not assume that they're necessarily measuring the same thing, but also be cautious about over kind of interpreting and importing findings. I will say, so for the one more point on this is for the study that I conducted on the segmentation, I did collect the Toronto alexithymia scale, and that didn't predict the segmentation performance. So I think that there are some ways in which some of these self-report measures do really robustly predict other self-report measures, but aren't always aligning with task. It kind of reminds me of the self-regulation literature and what's happening there, right? So you've got the self-regulation, self-report scales predicting one another and the behavioral tasks kind of clustering together. And then I actually, the affect optimization and differentiation point, I'd love to follow up with you on, because I'm not as familiar with that distinction. So hopefully I can learn more and see how it fits with how I've been thinking about these things.
Yeah, so Gisela Labo-Vivif was really taking a developmental point of view, and she was arguing that there's this kind of general optimization as opposed to having a really differentiated analysis of your affective experience, and that it's dynamic across the lifespan. And there was a long discussion, for example, whether older adults' tendency to have more positive emotionality is just kind of falling back to earlier developmental. There was a whole raging debate in the early 2000s, but some of the theoretical constructs that she advanced and the way she talked about it kind of reminded me of some of what you've been talking about. And so it may make sense to just look it up in case a reviewer brings it up. But yeah,
absolutely. Very helpful. We're a little bit prone to that in the emotion field, is rehashing old debates. So
can I know, James, you have a question, but I just wanted to maybe follow up on this developmental point that Karina raises. I'm curious, given the audience, Maria, is there any data on whether granularity changes across the lifespan? And if so, does valence in intra-individual change? Do you see differences in valence, I guess?
Yes, so I think there is some data. There's a paper from the 2000s that looked at it, so it wasn't using the ICC, but it was like a PCA approach to emotion reports, and did show kind of cohort effects, right? So older adults had more differentiated reports of emotion experience. There's not been a lot of work to my knowledge, though, and I think that this is, again, a really interesting kind of question, lifespan question. In terms of the so the one aging, like older adult aging paper that I was involved in, where we looked at, that was an emotion kind of sorting task, and participants were asked to sort faces, into piles based on their expressions. And unfortunately there we had a lot of negative expressions and, one positive. This is like the perennial problem with our study designs. We didn't do enough to tap positive. And so I think, that kind of data would be really interesting to know whether there's sort of more precision and elaboration in the positive domain compared to the negative, but we just can't get at it because our stimuli were not sufficient. So so what I'll say is that for positive emotion granularity, generally people are lower. So we see there's this asymmetry, and some of it relates to attention, right? So a lot more attention is paid to negative emotions, and that may kind of feed back into how granular or differentiated they are. And so it's likely, right, that if individuals are kind of promoting and experiencing more positive emotions in older adulthood, that you would see that granularity is increasing for those emotions, right? And there's this kind of asymmetry, but I'm not sure it's been looked at.
Thank you. James, I know you have a question. Do you want to ask your question?
This has been so fascinating, and I really love the direction you were going to with the psychophysiology and some of the work. I was able to collaborate with Adam Anderson and Eve DeRosa on interoception, and not only sensing your heartbeat, which is kind of classic interoception task, but whether the magnitude of one's automatic facial mimicry to viewing another facial emotion seemed to help predict your accuracy in sensing ambiguous faces that were controlled to have a certain expression, like a percent expression. I'm just curious your thoughts on what you would predict, what data you have on interoception and its role.
Yeah, so this was one of those sad moments where we tried to fit too much in our study. We did initially plan to at least include a cardiac interoception task in the study that we have ongoing, but we had to cut it for time. We have some very strict restrictions on how long our psych pool students can do studies, and we wanted to be able to sample from them too. But it is on the table for a future study, and I think it's an important question. Theoretically, we would predict that individuals, so in part, the interoception is sort of an additional path, right? That is, what the concepts that an individual has, right, are contributing to their segmentation, but to some extent, we would expect that there are these kind of interoceptive and kind of affective contributors too, right? So feeling with someone else is a pretty important route to how we go about understanding their states. And so it may be the case that individuals, right, who have more interoceptive sensitivity, right, who are mimicking more, that those kinds of effects are kind of promoting emotion segmentation. So it's a really nice hypothesis. I hope that we'll get to it, or somebody will, because I imagine that it also will contribute to the individual differences that we're observing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. I want to be mindful of time, so I want to thank our speaker today, Maria, for sharing your wonderful research with us. And for the rest of you guys, I'll see you next time. So thanks again, Maria. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was fun.